Welcome to Infidelity Diaries. Explore the secrets and stories of infidelity with us. Sometimes it seems to me that my relationship with Daniel is like it's behind glass. We're together, living under the same roof, sleeping in the same bed, but there's an invisible barrier between us. It doesn't stop us from seeing each other. It doesn't prevent us from speaking, but touching each other through it, that's impossible. It's a thin line, imperceptible, but insurmountable. And eventually, you get used to its existence, accepting it as something normal. Everything seems to be in place. The house, cozy and spacious, where I spent so long choosing every detail of the interior, creating the perfect space for us. Every morning begins the same way. Daniel makes coffee, I kiss him on the cheek in passing. We exchange the usual phrases about our plans for the day, work, the weather. It seems like everything is fine. No one argues, no one yells. But in this silent calm, there's something threatening, emptiness, the kind that can't be filled, no matter how many words, actions, or routines there are. One day, I realized that I hadn't felt truly alive for a long time. It doesn't seem like much to ask life for something real, a feeling that hits you in the heart, maybe something warm, joyful, or on the contrary, something strong, like the rumble of a storm. It felt like I was stuck in a quiet lull, and that stillness was killing me. The decision to sign up for yoga came spontaneously. I had always wanted to try, but never got around to it. That day, I saw an ad for a studio not far from home and thought, why not? And perhaps it was one of the best decisions I've made in a long time. I thought it would become something like a new hobby, something to distract me from the monotony. But I couldn't have imagined that it would change everything. When I first walked into the studio, the air was filled with the scent of sandalwood and a subtle freshness. It was quiet. The light fell softly, almost gliding along the walls, and I immediately felt that I'd be comfortable there. Everything looked so calm and orderly. The walls were in pastel tones, a few green plants by the windows, thin curtains gently swaying in the breeze. This place felt like the complete opposite of my own life. Here, you could linger and take a deep breath without rushing. It was then that I first met Simon. He approached me with a soft smile, and his voice, not too loud, but confident, immediately caught my attention. I liked the way he spoke, unhurried but precise, as if every sound he made was meant to penetrate your consciousness and stay there for a while. "First time?" he asked, looking at me. I nodded. "Yes, I decided to try something new," I answered, smiling weakly. But inside, I was already feeling something else, something I couldn't yet identify. Simon quickly explained what we would be doing. He moved gracefully, as if this wasn't physical activity, but a natural extension of himself. Yoga, as it turned out, wasn't just about stretching or trying to maintain balance. It was an entire ritual. During the first session, I struggled to follow the instructions. My mind kept wandering, as if rejecting these new sensations. But gradually, I immersed myself in the process. Breathing, focus, slow movements. It surprisingly worked. When Simon said, "Feel your body," for the first time in a long while, I really did feel it. And it amazed me. The silence that usually pressed down on me suddenly became a refuge. Each breath felt like a gulp of fresh air after being in a stuffy room for too long. By the end of the session, I felt a lightness that I hadn't experienced in a long time. It was astonishing how a few simple movements could free the mind from the heaviness of everyday life. I thanked Simon and stepped outside. The wind brushed against my face, and in that moment, I realized I didn't want to hurry home. I didn't want to return to the usual rhythm, where everything had long since become predictable and dull. Daniel? Why didn't I think about him when I was at the studio? Why didn't his face appear in my mind when I felt that peace and relief? He was always there, but somehow on the sidelines. We lived together, but our lives seemed to move in parallel. How many times in recent months had I said something to him, and he just nodded, lost in his own thoughts? Or, conversely, I hadn't heard his words because my thoughts were far away. That evening, I wondered for the first time, had we drifted so far apart that we couldn't come back? Sitting on the porch that night, I tried to remember our last real conversation, one where there weren't just routine phrases, automatic responses, but something genuine that connects two people. I couldn't recall one. That evening, I barely spoke to Daniel. All I could feel was the silence that filled the space between us. But now, that silence wasn't just emptiness. It was a rift that I could no longer ignore. At that moment, I didn't yet know that this first step into yoga was just the beginning of something that would change my life. Yoga quickly became something more than just a way to pass the time. It was like a return to myself, to my own sensations. I stopped perceiving the world around me the way I used to. In Simon's studio, time seemed to stand still, and all the external problems, the tension, everything that had been worrying me, stayed behind the closed door. The time spent there became my secret refuge, a place where I could be real. Every session was a kind of meditation, but not so much physical as emotional. Simon would always come closer, gently correcting my movements. His touches were so careful that they sometimes felt almost ethereal. I could feel his hands briefly touching my body, and I found myself holding my breath, waiting for those moments. Something inside me was persistently awakening, the very feeling I had long tried to ignore. "Megan, relax your shoulders," Simon said during one of the sessions when I had tensed up again. His voice was soft but firm. "I'm trying," I responded, smiling slightly. He moved closer, and his hands gently touched my shoulders. His touch was so light that it seemed to dissolve in the air. I took a deep breath and felt every cell in my body tense, but this time it wasn't because of the pose. "See? That's better," he whispered almost in my ear. I could feel his breath, and it stirred something inexplicable within me. At that moment, it seemed like everything else ceased to exist. "Yes, better," I repeated, not realizing that my words were barely louder than a whisper. We continued the session, but after that, I couldn't get the sensation of his hands on my shoulders out of my mind. Simon was always professional, but over the last few lessons, I started to notice that our glances lingered just a little longer than necessary. These moments were brief, almost imperceptible, but they sparked 1,000 questions in my mind. Daniel. No matter how hard I tried to distract myself, his image stood before me. He was so familiar, so usual, yet at the same time distant. When I came home after the sessions, he was often sitting at the computer, processing some documents, or watching the news. Our conversations had dwindled into brief exchanges that could have taken place between two complete strangers. "How was your day?" he would ask out of courtesy, not taking his eyes off the screen. "Fine," I'd reply, walking past and heading to the bathroom. We rarely talked about anything truly important. Everything had become so superficial. I noticed how, day by day, our conversations became more and more automated, almost like work. He didn't notice anything, or maybe he just didn't want to. One evening, after coming home from another session, I approached him with a cup of tea. We sat on the couch, and I finally mustered the courage to ask the question that had been haunting me for a long time. "Daniel, do you ever feel like we've changed?" I asked, choosing my words carefully. He looked up from the TV, frowning slightly, as if he didn't fully understand the question. "In what way?" I hesitated, unsure how to express what I was feeling. "I don't know, it just feels like we've grown apart. We barely talk anymore, haven't you noticed?" Daniel shrugged, clearly not giving it much thought. "We've just been busy with work. It's normal. You've got your own stuff going on with yoga. But that doesn't mean anything's wrong." His words didn't reassure me. Quite the opposite. I was struck by how easily he reduced everything to work. as if our relationship could be explained by a lack of time. Yeah, maybe you're right, I said, trying to convince myself of that. Yoga became my solace, my escape from what I couldn't put into words. With each lesson, I felt like Simon and I were getting closer, but on some invisible level. It wasn't about direct words or gestures. It was those subtle moments that sometimes meant more than anything else. At one session, as the group started to leave, Simon stayed behind to talk to me. You seemed tense today. Is everything okay? His gaze was focused on me, and I could see concern in his eyes. I didn't know what to say. The uncertainty was tormenting me, both in yoga and in life. Just thoughts. I tried to brush it off, but I must have done it too unconvincingly. If you need to talk, you know where to find me, he smiled. But there was something more than just friendliness in that smile. And once again, I felt that strange tension between us. At first, I dismissed it as my imagination, but the more time we spent together, the more I felt this invisible connection. Something inside me was drawn to him, even though my mind told me it was wrong. At home, everything continued on autopilot. I tried to return to the usual routine, to be the same with Daniel as before, but something had already changed. I couldn't figure out what was missing in our relationship, but with each passing day, I felt an increasing distance. It was as if an invisible wall was growing between us, separating us from each other. One night, lying in bed next to Daniel, I tried to talk to him again. Do you feel like something has changed? My voice was quiet, afraid to disturb the strange silence that had filled our home. He turned to me, sleepy and clearly annoyed that I had interrupted his peace. Megan, what kind of questions are these? Everything's fine. We're just tired. Let's sleep, okay? I fell silent. The answer was clear. I wouldn't get what I was looking for from him. And the more I tried to talk to him, the clearer it became that these conversations would change nothing. After one of the sessions, Simon held my gaze longer than usual. I noticed his eyes slightly narrowing, as if he was pondering something, trying to decide whether to continue the conversation. I had a strange feeling that this moment would be different. My heart skipped a beat, and I was surprised at how open I felt to whatever was about to happen. Will you stay for a bit? His voice was quiet, almost intimate, as if he didn't want to disturb the silence of the studio. I nodded, trying to hide the slight nervousness that had taken hold of me. Not because I needed to learn a new pose. No, it was something else. A desire to be near him, to hear his voice for just a few more minutes, to feel his presence. We climbed to the studio's rooftop. This place had always been special. It was quiet, and no one came here after classes. The open air, the city below, the sky shifting from light blue to golden orange. The wind gently played with my hair, and with each step, I felt the tension in my body growing. I think you understand why yoga is so important to me, Simon began, approaching the edge of the roof and gazing into the distance. I nodded silently, unsure of what to say. His words always seemed like more than just instructions. They carried something deeper, a wisdom I wasn't yet able to fully grasp. It's not just about the physical body, you know, he continued, slowly turning to face me. It's about the balance within, about how we search for stability in this chaotic world. His words resonated deeper than I had expected. It wasn't just philosophy. It was something I had long felt but couldn't express, as if he was describing my own life, my own search. Sometimes it feels like we're so busy trying to control the external world that we lose ourselves, he added, taking a step closer. His words made me shudder. I suddenly realized that I had long since lost that self. And now, standing here, next to him, I felt that I wanted this more than anything else, more than the balance he spoke of. And you? Have you found that balance? I asked, looking up at him. He hesitated for a moment, his eyes softening, and the corners of his mouth lifting in a barely visible smile. I'm still searching, he admitted, his voice warmer than usual. We stood in silence, The wind played with our hair, and the sky above us slowly changed its hues. This moment was so quiet, so intimate, that it held more meaning than any conversation. And then it happened. I didn't even have time to realize what was going on. He moved closer to me slowly, so naturally that it didn't feel sudden. Our eyes met, and I saw in his the same thing I was feeling inside: silence, tension, anticipation. Without warning, without words, we were closer than we should have been. Our lips met. All I knew in that moment was that I hadn't felt so alive in a long time. When we pulled away, I felt my heart pounding so hard that I could hear it in my ears. Simon looked at me, his face calm, but there was the same confusion in his eyes that I felt within. "This wasn't supposed to happen," he said quietly, but his voice was filled with the same doubt that clouded my thoughts. I couldn't respond. My mind was torn between joy and guilt, but in that moment, I couldn't think of Daniel, of our home, of what was right or wrong. All I knew was that this moment was real, and it was enough for me. I couldn't bring myself to leave. We remained standing on the rooftop, watching the sunset, saying nothing more. After that kiss with Simon, everything changed. I tried to act as if nothing had happened, but my thoughts, they wouldn't obey. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face. I heard his voice, felt his touch. It was like a virus, infecting every cell of my consciousness. No matter what I did, I couldn't rid myself of him. At some point, I realized that I was no longer in control. Every day of yoga became not just a way to restore physical balance, but an escape. Time spent in the studio became a moment when I could be myself again, free from the role of the perfect wife. There, next to Simon, there was no need to pretend, to be proper or convenient. With him, I felt alive. And that feeling was terrifying in its intensity. But at home, everything was different. With Daniel, I fell more and more silent. We still shared a life. We had dinner together, discussed household matters, watched TV in the evenings. But between us, a silence was growing. I could feel it physically. A thick veil that hung between us every time he tried to start a conversation, and I would look away. One evening, when I returned from class, he was, as usual, sitting on the couch with his phone in hand. I walked past him to the bedroom, intending to quickly change, when suddenly I heard his voice, tinged with a strange dissatisfaction. "Megan, wait, can we talk?" Those words threw me off balance. I froze at the bedroom door, turned to him, but my heart was pounding so hard that it seemed like he could hear it. "About what?" I tried to hide the nervousness in my voice, forcing myself to remain as calm as possible. He looked at me, and in his eyes, there was a mix of irritation and expectation, as if he was seeking confirmation of his suspicions, but wasn't ready to hear what it might be. "You've been acting strange for weeks. What's going on?" His voice was steady, but I could feel the tension in every word. I took a deep breath and tried to remember when it had started, but it was like a blurred line. I couldn't even recall the last time we had a real conversation. "Nothing's happening, Daniel. I'm just tired," I lied, knowing it was too weak of an excuse for the changes he had obviously noticed. He scoffed in disbelief and looked back at his phone. "If you're tired, maybe it's time to take a vacation. We could go somewhere, relax, together." His suggestion sounded reasonable, but I knew that wasn't the cause of my behavior. A trip wouldn't change anything. We could be in the most beautiful place on earth, but the distance between us wouldn't disappear. The barrier that had silently and irreversibly grown between us would remain, no matter where we went. "Yeah, maybe," I replied, though I knew it wouldn't happen. I retreated to the bathroom, turned on the water, and leaned against the cold wall, letting it cool me down. Inside, everything was boiling. I felt like a traitor. But at the same time, there was something I couldn't control: this attraction to Simon, which had become like an addiction. I could no longer imagine a day without thinking of him, and that dual conflict was tearing me apart from within. Every morning, I woke up with a sense of guilt. I felt like it was written all over my face. Betrayal, deceit, lies. And every time Daniel looked at me, I was afraid that he saw it, sensed it. He couldn't have missed the fact that I had distanced myself. It was too obvious. But he had no idea how much my inner world had changed, what decision I had already made, even if I hadn't fully realized it yet. At yoga, Simon never brought up the kiss, but our glances now held something that couldn't be ignored. We were no longer just teacher and student. Every exchange of words between us was laced with subtext, with a hidden passion that we both tried to contain. But I knew it was temporary. Sooner or later, we would find ourselves back on that rooftop, where there would be no yoga, no talk of balance. One day, after class, I caught myself no longer wanting to pretend. I could no longer control my desire to be with him. It was like a rushing current pulling me towards a waterfall, and I realized there was no turning back. I would either jump or I would stay where I was, forever haunted by the thought that I had never tried. I approached Simon after everyone had left. We stood face to face, and I felt the air between us heating up. "Do you feel it?" I asked quietly, hardly believing I had dared to speak about it. Simon looked at me, his eyes darkening. He was silent, as if searching for the right words, but at that moment I realized that the answers no longer mattered. "Yes," he replied, and there was more in his voice than just agreement. That moment was pivotal. We could no longer go back. And I knew, from now on, my life was divided into before and after. When Simon suggested going to a yoga retreat out of town, I barely had time to be surprised at how quickly I made my decision. Perhaps, deep inside, I had already made up my mind long ago. I just hadn't fully realized it yet. This entire month, I had been caught in an internal whirlpool where some emotions pulled me down into guilt, while others, like a quiet whisper, urged me to take a step forward. A step toward him. "It's just a retreat," I told myself as I packed my things. A getaway, a break. I kept telling myself that this would be my way of sorting things out, of finding the answers I needed. But, to be honest, I already knew that it was just an excuse. I wanted to be with him, to feel his presence, hear his voice, see the way he looked at me, unlike anyone else ever had. The old abandoned temple where the retreat was held seemed to belong to another time. Moss-covered walls, ancient stone steps leading upwards to majestic columns, which barely held the weight of time. The whole place was surrounded by forest, and there was a stillness so thick it felt tangible, a silence unbroken by cars or city noise. Only the wind rustling the leaves and the faint whisper of distant trees. We set up camp not far from the temple. Simon was calm, as always, but I felt his presence with every nerve in my body. We practiced yoga, breathed in the pure air, but each breath I took was filled with something else, anticipation of what was to come. And I could no longer deceive myself. This wasn't about yoga or finding balance. It was just me and him, and this tension between us, which was becoming unbearable. At night, we gathered around the campfire, a small group of 4. Sitting under the starry sky, I listened to conversations about life, balance, and inner peace. But each time someone spoke, I felt my thoughts slipping back to him, to Simon. Every gesture he made, every smile, every fleeting glance between us, it all led me to the inevitable. When the others left, leaving us alone by the fire, I couldn't resist any longer. I didn't even want to. It felt so natural that I didn't have time to be afraid of what would happen next. "Megan." His voice was soft when we were finally alone. "You know this isn't just a retreat for you, don't you?" I nodded. Words didn't matter. All I needed was his presence beside me. I looked at him, and suddenly my thoughts became perfectly clear. "Yes, I know," I said, gazing at the fire that flickered between us, casting a warm glow on his face. He moved closer, and this time I felt no fear. It was more than just desire. It was a force I could no longer fight. When he sat next to me, I felt his warmth. My hand accidentally brushed against his, and that touch was enough to break the last barrier. I turned to him, and our eyes met. In his gaze, I saw everything I felt myself. I didn't resist because I knew resistance had long since lost its meaning. Our lips met again. I was the person I hadn't allowed myself to be for a long time. Without fear, without doubt, without expectations. We were silent for a long time, but that silence was rich, like a breath of fresh air. He held my hand, and I let that sensation envelop me completely. "You know that everything will change after this," Simon said, not looking at me, his voice barely a whisper. I nodded, but at that moment, it didn't seem important. Everything had already changed. We had crossed a line that had been invisible, but undeniably real. And I wasn't afraid. The only thing that scared me was that it might end. That this moment, this feeling, this awareness of reality might vanish as quickly as it had begun. I stared into the fire, feeling the air around us slowly cool, and I understood that there was no point in turning back. Returning home after the retreat felt like plunging into icy water. I knew I would have to face reality, to confront what was waiting for me beyond the doorstep. But I wasn't prepared for how unbearable that feeling would become. The home that had always been a place of comfort and peace for me now felt alien, as if I no longer belonged there, no longer belonged to this life. Daniel greeted me at the door with a smile, just like always. He was happy to see me, and there was genuine care shining in his eyes. "How was it? Did you relax?" His voice was soft, filled with that familiar warmth that always made me feel safe. But this time, I didn't feel safe. I only felt the weight of guilt, growing heavier with every word he spoke. "Yes, it went well," I replied, trying to avoid meeting his gaze. He stepped closer and hugged me, as if wanting to show me that he had missed me, that he was glad I was back. And that touch, once so natural and comforting, suddenly became unbearable. I felt my heart tighten as I realized that I could no longer be with him the way I used to. Every gesture, every kiss, every touch now reminded me of how much I had changed. They highlighted the gap between us, a gap I had created with my own hands. It was like an invisible wall I couldn't break down, no matter how hard I tried. That night, we went to bed, and I felt Daniel reach out to touch me. His fingers brushed my shoulder, and instead of the usual comfort, it brought me only irritation. I couldn't bear the contact. My body seemed to reject his closeness, as if he were a stranger. "Are you okay?" he asked, turning toward me. His voice was filled with concern he didn't even try to hide. "Yeah, just tired," I lied, turning away from him. It was a lie that was becoming a part of me. I couldn't tell him the truth. I couldn't admit that my thoughts no longer belonged to him, that my heart was now with someone else. Simon had filled my mind, and that feeling left no room for Daniel. In his embrace, all I felt was cold. With each passing day, I noticed how Daniel tried harder and harder to reconnect with me. He suggested we go away for the weekend, do something together to reclaim the closeness we had lost. I saw how much he was trying. He was fighting to bring us back to what we had. But I could no longer be the person I once was. "Megan, maybe we could go somewhere, into nature, just for the weekend. Just the two of us to relax," he suggested one night over dinner. His voice was full of hope, but inside, I tensed up. I couldn't imagine spending time alone with him when every moment my heart and mind were consumed by someone else. "Maybe," I replied quietly, trying not to meet his eyes. I felt the distance between us growing, and the more he tried to bridge it, the further I drifted away. It seemed like I no longer belonged to this life. My thoughts and emotions were now elsewhere, and with each passing day, I became more aware that there was no way back. Every morning, I woke up with a sense of guilt. It pained me that I couldn't give Daniel what he deserved. He deserved someone who could love him the way I used to, but I no longer could. My heart belonged to someone else, and this realization weighed on me like a burden I couldn't escape. One night, as I lay next to Daniel, I heard him sigh heavily as he turned to his side of the bed. His hand slowly slid toward mine, as if searching for any sign of connection. But instead of responding, I remained still, pretending to be asleep. I couldn't bring myself to reciprocate his gesture, couldn't let him feel the emptiness that now lay between us. I could no longer be with him. Our lives had become so different that I felt I was living in another place, with another person, in another reality. I had been thinking about it for a long time, endlessly sifting through my thoughts, as if trying to find that one perfect reason to end it all. At first, I thought I could do it easily, that I had the strength to put a full stop. I kept telling myself that this was temporary, that I was just confused, that I needed to stop it before it was too late. And then the day came when I decided to meet Simon. This was supposed to be the final goodbye. I chose a neutral place, a small cafe on the corner where no one knew us, where we could remain unnoticed. My heart was pounding as I walked there, and I kept trying to convince myself that I was doing the right thing. I felt the betrayal eating me from the inside, that living in constant lies was no longer possible. And if I didn't stop it now, I would lose everything: Daniel, myself, even the faint hope that Simon and I had something real. Simon arrived early. He was sitting by the window, a cup of coffee in his hands. When I walked in, he looked up at me, and in his eyes, I saw something that both tore me apart and pulled me back in. That moment was painfully familiar, a tangle of desire and guilt, impossible to unravel. He smiled at me, but I noticed a hint of tension in his eyes, as if he knew I had come with the intention of changing something. I sat down across from him, feeling my whole body tense up. My heart was beating so loudly that it seemed Simon could hear it. "Megan, is something wrong?" he asked softly, leaning toward me. His voice had always been so calming, as if he could lift the weight off my shoulders with just a word. I lowered my eyes, looking at my hands, which were clutching a napkin. "We need to talk," I finally said, exhaling as if it took all the strength I had left. He was silent, giving me time. His gaze was fixed on me, and I knew that he already understood what I was about to say. "I can't do this anymore. It's tearing me apart. I'm destroying my life." "I can't go on like this, Simon. It's not right," I said, finally letting out the words I had been carrying for so long, feeling how each phrase drained more and more energy from me. He leaned back, listening intently, but his eyes didn't show surprise or disappointment. Rather, understanding, mixed with something else. Only later did I realize it was stubbornness. "I understand how you feel," he said quietly, his voice still calm. "But that doesn't mean everything we've been through was wrong." His words hit me harder than I expected. I felt my fingers tighten around the napkin. He wasn't trying to argue or dissuade me. He spoke as if it were inevitable. "We knew this couldn't last forever," he continued. "But that doesn't mean what we have doesn't matter." My head spun from his words. I had come here to put an end to it, but now everything he was saying felt like just another excuse. And worst of all, I felt myself starting to agree with him. "But what now, Simon?" I blurted out, realizing that my voice was trembling. "What now?" "I can't destroy everything I have. I can't keep living in this split between two worlds. I can't keep lying." Simon sighed and reached across the table, gently touching my fingers. His touch was warm, comforting, as always. And in that moment, I felt the wall I had tried to build between us begin to crumble. "No one said it would be easy, Megan," he said softly. "But I know you feel the same as I do. And you can't deny that." His words made me freeze again. I knew I should leave. This conversation was supposed to be the end. But his touch, his voice, his gaze, all of it was pulling me back, as if I no longer had the strength to resist. I stood up, hoping that the movement would give me the resolve I needed. But instead of leaving, I found myself next to him. He stood too, never taking his eyes off me, and I knew he saw everything: my weakness, my desire, my guilt. I felt his arms wrap around me, and in that moment, I realized that everything I had been thinking, everything I had wanted to say, vanished. I was in his embrace again, and all my resolve dissolved like smoke. The kiss was inevitable. As soon as our lips touched, I knew I had lost control of myself. I knew it couldn't go on like this for long. Lies are like smoldering coals that sooner or later ignite into a fire. I could deceive myself into thinking I had control of the situation, but deep down, I knew everything was falling apart. Every time I came home, I felt that Daniel and I were becoming more distant, and my attempts to act as before felt more and more forced. And one day, it all exploded. It happened in the evening while I was making dinner. Nothing unusual, no warning signs. I was lost in my thoughts, trying to pretend I had control over my life. And then Daniel walked into the kitchen with his phone in hand, his face tense, and from the look in his eyes, I knew. He had found something out. "Megan, can you explain this?" His voice was quiet, but there was something threatening in it that made me freeze. I turned around, and he handed me his phone. On the screen, our chat with Simon was glowing. Several messages, the very ones I had tried to delete. I felt the blood drain from my face. My heart pounded so hard, it seemed like it would burst out of my chest. I was still hoping I could come up with some explanation, that I could fix everything. But as soon as my eyes met his, I realized it was pointless to lie any further. "What is this?" he repeated, his voice trembling slightly. I opened my mouth, but no words came. I was trying to find something, anything to say, but at that moment, everything became so clear. I could no longer pretend. The moment I started to speak, I felt like I was destroying everything we had built over the years. And though it was inevitable, I still wasn't ready. It's… I… My voice betrayed me, and I paused briefly. "I've been cheating on you, Daniel." Those words, spilling out of me, seemed to cut through the silence of the room, hanging in the air, and I saw his face slowly change. First, there was pain, indescribable pain that reflected in his eyes. His hands clenched into fists, and I saw him struggling not to yell at me. He was breathing deeply, his chest rising and falling too sharply. "With who?" he asked, looking at me with such intensity that I wanted to disappear. "With Simon," I whispered, as if hoping that saying it softly might somehow soften the blow. But it didn't help. I saw his face shift from pain to anger, and then to some kind of total emptiness. "Simon," he repeated, as if testing the name on his tongue. "Your yoga instructor? Are you serious?" I nodded, though my voice failed me. I wanted to say more, to try to explain how it had all happened, but I didn't know how. How do you explain something you don't fully understand yourself? I saw how his rage battled to stay inside. His hands were trembling as he gripped the phone, and in his eyes, I saw complete disbelief. As if it were so absurd, he couldn't believe it had really happened. "How long has this been going on?" he asked, his voice cracking, his gaze hardening. "A few months," I admitted, feeling my legs weaken under the weight of those words. "A few months?" He stepped back, as if what I had said physically pushed him away. I could see how he was struggling with his anger, with his pain. His eyes, filled with hurt, looked at me, and I realized that this moment had become his breaking point. When the door slammed shut behind Daniel, the world around me froze. I was left alone, and the silence, which had once seemed terrifying, now felt inevitable. At first, I just sat on the floor, my head in my hands, waves of realization crashing over me. I had destroyed everything. My life, our relationship. Everything was ruined by my own hands. And worst of all, I couldn't justify myself, couldn't find an excuse for my actions. I could no longer lie, not even to myself. I had to stay alone with my thoughts, and for the first time in a long while, I allowed them to fully consume me. No more trying to push them away, forget, or hide. I could no longer run from what I had done. The connection with Simon. When I first truly thought about it, I realized that it was never really about him. It was about me. Simon became my way of escaping the monotony, the emptiness that had settled between me and Daniel. I wanted to feel alive again, to experience emotions that had long been lost. But I realized too late that it was all an illusion that destroyed everything that was real to me. Simon was nothing more than a symbol of my desire to run away. I was searching for something in him that I thought was lost, but in truth, I had never tried to find it in myself or in my relationship with Daniel. I blame myself for that, for not seeing the real problem sooner. But now that everything had crumbled, I had no choice but to face the consequences head on. I sat alone in our empty house, and for the first time in a long while, I had to think about who I really was and what I truly wanted. I could no longer rely on someone else, couldn't seek comfort in others. I had destroyed Daniel's trust, destroyed our relationship. But most of all, I had destroyed myself. The few weeks that followed Daniel's departure were the hardest of my life. I couldn't sleep, couldn't focus. I kept going back in my mind to the moment when I could have stopped, when I could have chosen a different path. But in remembering all of this, I realized that I couldn't change the past. Now, I faced a new challenge, rebuilding myself and my life from scratch. One morning, when I woke up, I looked at myself in the mirror, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't see a lost person. I saw someone who was ready to start again. It was a moment of realization. I understood that I couldn't run anymore. I could no longer hide behind other people's decisions, feelings, or fears. This was my life, and only I could change it. I let go of Simon, realizing that our relationship had never been real. It had only been a way to avoid my own problems, immersing myself in someone else's illusions. I also let go of Daniel, knowing that he deserved better than what I had been able to give him in the last few months. I didn't know if we would ever be able to rebuild our relationship, but I knew one thing. He had to find his own path, just as I had to find mine. I had a difficult road ahead. Rebuilding myself after everything that had happened wasn't easy, but it was a path I needed to take to find myself. I was no longer afraid of the silence, no longer afraid of being alone. I knew there would be many challenges ahead, many moments of doubt and pain, but I also knew that this was the beginning of a new life, one that I could build on my own terms. Now I understood that running away from my problems was not the solution. It was only temporary relief that ultimately destroyed everything around me. I was ready to take responsibility for my actions and begin repairing what I had broken, not for someone else, but for myself. I didn't know what lay ahead, but for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of it. I was ready to face the future with an open heart and a clear mind, knowing that now, this was my journey, and I had to walk it alone.